Okay, so I've been having this thought recently, and one I feel compelled to share. Games are a form of entertainment media, ones that create experience through user engagement and interaction. But when we think about games and when we talk about games, we don't necessarily consider how these interactions convey narrative within the experience. I mean that we don't think about how game narratives have a different set of needs with drastically different outcomes, all while functioning as a piece of entertainment. So maybe we should think of games beyond just being media entertainment. Rather, we can also see games as something akin to literature, one with unique constraints and possibilities. Let me explain.
I like books. No, I love books. I read books all the time, and every time I read a book, I always think about how the story best utilizes the medium. Like this book, or this book, or this book. They all tell meaningful stories, but the way these stories are told demands the story is told through a book. That's why it's always felt weird to me to compare a novel to its film adaptation. Well, yes, they are telling the same story, but fundamentally the story has been thoroughly restructured. Like the Lord of the Rings movies, they're true to the books, but they're also relatively different from the books. But this isn't a bad thing, not necessarily, as the movies tell the story from the book the best way it could for a movie. Because movies have an entirely different set of needs and constraints. So rather than trying to stay perfectly one-to-one, adapting a book to the screen demands a focus on themes, emotions, and characters more so than moment-to-moment details. There are things we're going to just be more engaged with in a film anyway. In a movie, we don't pay attention to every background detail, but the whole main image made from that detail helps set that mood, the emotions, the character, and the narrative.
One of my favorite feelings is finishing a really good book and putting it back on my bookshelf and then just stepping back to look at it and remember the experiences that I had reading that book. I get excited just looking through and thinking about all those moments and memories I had from the experience of reading. This is the same reason that I love collecting physical games. I like stepping back and looking at the boxes and remembering all the journeys I've had and all the journeys that I can continue to have in the future with new games. And I think about all the work and thought that went into that game and that product. But when I reflect, I'm amazed by how well all these mediums of media accomplish the same thing through drastically different methods. Books, movies, TV, theater, games. All of these things entertain us with narrative, even if minimalist, but every single medium reaches that goal in a completely unique way. However, games are a particularly interesting commodity in the vast field of media. Sure, every form of media requires some engagement from the audience. In fact, sometimes I feel like there isn't such a thing as sitting back and relaxing, as every piece of media we engage with demands that we are engaged. When we watch a movie, we are an active participant. Reading a book, we're the ones flipping the page and creating that mental image from every paragraph. But with a game, this engagement is heightened, as we have a controller in our hands. Not only the images we see, but the actions that are literally happening on screen are dependent on our controls and what we decide to do. The world is conforming to us, and we're the ones making those things happen.
This leads to a sort of identity crisis with games. How do we even define what a game is supposed to do or what a game is supposed to be? Is a game a way of conveying narrative experience, or is it just a rhythmically satisfying flow and weaving of mechanics? Think about it. We have games like God of War, deep narrative experiences utilizing player action to tell a narrative. But we also have games like Beat Saber with endlessly satisfying and fun feedback loops, but not an actual narrative.
But this isn't a criticism of Beat Saber for not being a narrative experience. That isn't a failure of the game. It's just not a game that would need or benefit from it. Like, yeah, Beat Saber might even be worse if the action was framed in a narrative. It would just feel silly. But I bring this up to acknowledge that these are two deeply contrasting philosophies. Conveying narrative or conveying fun and enjoyment. When I read a book or watch a movie, I expect to be told something, that media is going to have something to say, even if unserious. There's always some sort of arc, some form of narrative, but games don't really need that.
Games can be landmark narrative experiences, but they ultimately operate completely separately from narrative.
Games don't have to be fun, but it's totally okay for games to solely be fun without focusing on using that fun for any real narrative arc. Sure, maybe this means that games are inherently worse narrative devices because they literally do not operate in narrative, but I don't necessarily think that this is critical of the way that games convey narrative. Sure, we have games like Beat Saber, but we also have books of comic strips that are focused on humor and fun and not narrative. This doesn't mean that they are any lesser in quality, it just means that every form of media can have multiple different purposes.
I mentioned God of War earlier, and I want to talk more about games as narrative experiences. Just like books and movies and theater and TV, games as a medium fundamentally have a unique way of telling stories. One which is possibly harder to grasp, as the narrative experience is targeted solely at the individual who is currently playing. God of War is pretty cinematic in design, but the game operates best as it was designed, as a game. The narrative is made meaningful by picking up the controller and playing.
But even then, God of War can still be enjoyed, albeit in a very different way, by sitting next to the person with the controller and watching. For some games, this position is much less enticing. Like, Celeste is one of the most engaging experiences I have ever engaged with, but I think it would mean a lot less if I was just watching from the side, because there, I'm not feeling things, I'm just watching. And with a game that difficult, I'm probably watching the death screen appear many, many times. The difficulty is part of the narrative, but sitting from the side, I'm not getting remotely the same experience as the person who's playing. Really, some games need to be played to be appreciated in their fullest.
This makes it so interesting when we see media subcultures dedicated to watching people play games. On Twitch, people can watch people play games and derive joy from the experience, though this isn't always due to the game, but rather from the person playing the game. This raises the dilemma of, am I watching for the game or for the person? And that's a big question. Though I can't answer that right now, the fact that it comes to mind goes to show that playing games and watching games are drastically different experiences. Games as narrative experiences are perhaps a bit bizarre. The designers have to not only consider the narrative, but how that narrative engages with the gameplay. How do the two work together to create a meaningful experience? Games can immerse people into the world where players engage in emergent narratives based on their own role-playing actions. So the world then becomes a design-focused feature that draws players into roleplay to create narrative. But games can also be very focused in how they tell narrative, perhaps de-emphasizing roleplay to put the player in more defined roles and situations. The Life is Strange games employ this sort of narrative, still using the game design medium effectively to best tell that narrative. But with more focused and defined gameplay pieces, these games tell stories much quicker than those emergent games. Even when focusing on narrative, the way that games operate are diverse and expansive in potential. Recently, there's been some worrying discussion about games with longer playtimes being inherently more valuable, as every dollar spent on the game equates to more entertainment. I find this rhetoric both silly and concerning. While yes, you can maximize your dollar-to-hour ratio, but ultimately it isn't the length of the game that matters, but the quality and content of the experience. Maybe a game is shorter, but maybe also it's more focused and thoughtful. Let's think about this in a different way. When I buy a movie ticket, I buy a ticket for the movie I want to see at that moment, not the one that's the longest. Last year I watched both Avatar: The Way of Water and Puss in Boots: The Last Wish in theaters. While Avatar was a longer film and my dollar-to-hour ratio was technically superior, both experiences were similarly worthwhile. If we judge purely based off of dollar to hours, Ben-Hur would be my favorite movie, or maybe Avatar 3 when that comes out. The point I'm trying to illustrate here is that game design as a medium is a unique and effective way to convey narrative. When people play a game, they can extract something thoughtful and impactful from the experience, much like they can with any other piece of literature. This calls for finding the right medium for each particular story. Like, When the Percy Jackson movies came out, they failed to remain sincere to the books and convey that narrative on the screen. But by shifting mediums, the upcoming Percy Jackson TV show looks to be more sincere in its conversion of the book's narrative. We just need to find the right way to tell the stories that matter. For instance, I'm a game design student. I'm studying game design because I'm interested in how to best utilize games as a medium to tell narrative. But beyond games, it is my larger desire to tell stories. And sometimes a game is great for that, and sometimes it isn't. It just depends on the story. Sometimes I have to pivot to new mediums to say the things I want to say. I've written narrative for games, for student films, and even for a novel. Each one of these is remarkably different in how it tells stories, and that excites me. I like being able to tell stories across mediums, each one unique with so many possibilities. Games are like literature, able to tell narratives in a unique way. Games can operate like literature in how those experiences convey something meaningful and important, be it deep or complex themes, interesting philosophy, or maybe even just some simple fun. We need to think of games not just as pieces of entertainment, but as focused tools for creating meaningful experiences.